Education. I'm also now the Associate Vice Provost for Academic Innovation. Thank you. More important, I'm the MC for this lecture series, a role that I've had now for 10 years, and it is a lot of fun. You can read the history of this lecture series on the piece of paper on your table in front of you, but this is the university's oldest interdisciplinary lecture series going back to the 1980s, when it was started over in the Westminster House, the Presbyterian University Center. We moved it here immediately after the pandemic with the support of FSU Libraries. Thank you so much, Libraries, for hosting. Yay! The Office of Research to pay for the lunch. Yay! And the Office of Faculty Development and Advancement to help with all the advertising and promoting, and which is fantastic. Yay! We have a wonderful group of interdisciplinary steering committee members, many of them in this room, who suggest speakers, and we're always looking for ideas. So if you have ideas, feel free to email me. We're very excited to welcome today's speaker in particular, because the last time we had someone at this lecture series speak about politics was in October of 2016 when Dr. Carol Weissert spoke to us. So, thank you, Carol.
I'm still here.
Let's see, what else was I going to say? Oh, right, one thing, also on the page here, you can see our speakers coming up for this next series. Our next one is coming up in very short due order, because we're doing a crossover event with FSU's Discovery Days. So that's coming up very quickly in October, yay, which is going to be a lot of fun. So please don't miss that. We have a great series going on here. And so much of what we're trying to do here is promote these interdisciplinary connections that bring faculty out of their offices and sharing their interdisciplinary ideas. If you like that concept, check out the new series that I'm running over at the Innovation Hub called Faculty Innovators, which meets every other Wednesday morning for coffee in the Innovation Hub. You can find that on the Innovation Hub website. That's a fun group as well. We're having a lot of fun there. So without further ado, I would like to invite John Carr, Professor of Sociology and Director of the Claude Pepper Center, to come up and introduce our speaker. Thank you.
No, I don't, as long as you all can hear me, that's okay. I have a little bit of a cold I'm getting over, so I'm going to try to speak up. But, so when we were talking about the speaker series for this year, it's exactly the right timing for this talk. So I'm really excited that Lonna, who is in my college, the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, is the premier expert in our university at this time on this subject, and we're really excited to hear you speak. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to how lucky we are to have Dr. Atkeson with us at FSU and here today. So Dr. Atkeson is the Leroy Collins, eminent scholar in civic education and political science. And she directs the Leroy Collins Institute. So if you haven't heard about that, I encourage you to look it up. It's an exciting center doing great work. This is a public policy think tank that we have at the university. She's also a member of the MIT Data and Election Science Board, which is the MEDSL, and the American National Election Studies Board. So there's a lot of areas that her research covers, and she's going to talk about kind of integrating a lot of these big ideas together today with this talk. She studies election science, election administration, survey research, public policy, voting rights, public opinion, and political behavior. And she has lots of publications. I won't go through all of them, but she has 4 books. She's published over 60 articles and book chapters. She's written lots of policy reports. And she's also received a number of awards. For example, she's received the Jack Taylor Best in Government Award from the Common Cause New Mexico, the Distinguished Service Award from Verified Voting New Mexico and United Voters of New Mexico, and the Excellence in Mentoring Award from the Society for Political Methodology. She also works in partnership outside of the university in her field. So she's been a consultant for important organizations, including the Department of Defense, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the Pew Charitable Trust, and several private companies where she's also served as an expert witness or consultant on legal cases. She also has a long history of engaging in political science in other aspects of the real world, including in 1994, she worked for Tommy Drake, a survey research firm in Boulder, Colorado, and from 2016 to 2021, she was the election and political analyst for the NBC affiliate KOB-TV in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she came to us from most recently. She has lots of support for her research. I'll name just a few, including the Pew Charitable Trust, as well as NSF, and several foundations and state organizations. So before becoming a political scientist, she's from the West, and she's joining us here from the West. She got her degree, her BA in Riverside, UC Riverside, and her PhD from Boulder at University of Colorado Boulder. So without further ado, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. I really appreciate that. I'm so excited to be here today to talk to you about the elections and the election landscape and try to put this election and what's happening into a bigger context and get you to think about sort of where we've been and where we are and maybe where we're going. Maybe it's a lot of the same, but sort of how can we put all of this together, because we all know that something's going wrong and it's been going wrong for a while. So how can we think about this? So the question for this election is really the same question that we ask in every presidential election, which is this a status quo election or is this a change election? And that's really the fundamental way. Are we going to vote for the same people, or are we going to elect somebody else and have change? And so do people want change, or do they want more of the same? And so a status quo election favors, of course, the incumbent party, and change election favors the out party. And so, just thinking back to sort of 2000, and 2000 is sort of a good starting point, right? Because that's the last time we had that electoral college oops, where the electoral college and the popular vote didn't match, and then we had it again in 2016, and maybe we could have it again in 2024. So what's happening here? What's going on? So of course, back in 2000, we had a change election with Bush-Cheney. And 2004, we have a status quo election, right? Because we kept them around. 2008, we have a change election. 2012, we have a status quo election. 2016, we have a change election. 2020, we have a change election. And then we have, 2024, are we going to have a change election, or are we going to have a status quo election? And who is the change person? And it's a little bit more complicated than normal, but I think that, if we look at this, obviously, we're changing characters, but there is, this dynasty that seems to be going on here. It's a very interesting one, and I don't know how often we've seen that kind of dynasty in American politics, where you have president, vice president, and then another vice president. That's quite a legacy and a dynasty. So I'm going to argue that they are the status quo candidates. The Democrats and the Republicans at least seem to be like the change candidate at the moment in 2024. But, I think that's arguable, and somebody could, certainly the Democrats are trying very hard to be the change party in the change election. So where have we been over the past 4 years? Or maybe we want to say the past 10 years or the past 16 years. And I say 10 years because 10 years is when I started feeling like in my gut that, gee, these things aren't right. There's something going on. Things aren't, I'm out here on this tail, suddenly that normal curve, and I was able to predict things. Suddenly things I wasn't able to predict them anymore, and I suddenly felt that I was living out on the tail of a normal curve, or the mean had shifted in society somehow. And I'm not sure what happened there. Are we still living on a tail? Are we going to come back to the mean, or are we shifted the mean? And so over that time, and I say 16 because that brings us back to the legacy of Obama. So, we're divided, we're polarized, and we're not very trustful. We have a lot of distrust. So here we were back in 2020. This is what the map looked like, just to give you sort of a reminder of where we were then. Biden got 306 electoral college votes. Donald Trump got 232. But of course, the expectation with the polling was that it was going to be an easy election, and it was not going to be a close electoral college vote. This is what we saw in 2016, practically the reverse, 304 for Trump, 227 for Clinton, right, 232 to 306. We are living in both a time of change and a time of stability. Right, there's a lot of stability under this, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. when you say polling over there, if you're referring to exit polls or polls, in the press?
Both. Oh, well, I'm talking about really the polls right now. I'm talking about, so back, and one thing I should probably say is back in 2016, I was asked to give a talk after the election as opposed to before the election at University of Indiana, and I was really focused on those polls and those poll aggregators. If you're elected, if you're addicted to the election, you can't get off of 538 and Nate Silver and reading all of this stuff, right? It's all very exciting and interesting, and I was too. And I was like, of course, this is going to be an easy election for the Democrats. So I was surprised when I was in the news station on 2016 and the results were coming in. And so I spent a good week, like 40 hours of my life figuring out where I went wrong. And I really was like, I focused on the polls. I focused on the aggregators. I didn't look at the fundamentals. So here I'm trying to give you more of those fundamentals. So that's where we were. We're very divided, right? And this is what we look like historically. All of these gray markers are places where we have divided federal government, where one party, right, is in control of at least one other branch of government. And we can see that unified control is very, very fleeting. Right, a very, very fleeting thing. We had unified control for a tiny bit when Biden got in, but then 2022, gone. So it's very fleeting. And alignments only last one federal election now, right? They just don't last very well at all. So here we have, right, change election, right here, right? And we just, it's always a mix of powers. It's very hard to govern. And if we look back at the 20th century, the average duration of control was twice as big as what it is today, right? So control of either house is going back and forth very, very often. We also have incredible polarization, right? And this is looking at approval gaps, so approval of each political party, right, during presidential terms. And we can see if we go back a long time, right, long time ago, there really wasn't as much polarization, and this has increased over time dramatically, such that, right, even now, you can find that Biden's polarization is greater than Trump's, right? And this all started, really with W, so this isn't that long ago. That this kind of polarization has happened. And if we were to look back on sort of presidential approval historically, like right after the election, right when the president just gets in office, there was historically this thing that we saw happening where the approval was always slightly higher than what the president got in the polls. Not anymore. Right now we just see this huge polarization. Democrats, right, the blue people hate the red president, the red people hate the blue president right off the bat. So that, we're really heavily polarized. And what's also worrisome is, right, we don't trust our institutions at all, and I'm really concerned that we don't trust the Supreme Court of the United States because, that's the institution that's actually supposed to be separate from politics, right? They're supposed to be above that. But instead, with polarization, it leads us to think more and more about them as politicians with robes. Right, and that's a problem. We don't want to see politicians as rogues, right? We want to see, Supreme Court justices with, special clothes that separate them from the rest of the people, and they're making decisions in some lofty way. But we can see how if you look over time right here, this is trust, obviously red is Republicans, blue is Democrats. So they're really actually, there's certainly things happen, there's events that cause differences between evaluations, but there are many times where they're very close together in their evaluations. But then, what happens in 2022, right? Here we are in this 5-4 court, right? We go into a 6-3 court, where 6 of the justices are appointed by Republicans, and oh my God, the polarization on the courts just skyrockets. Very disturbing, right? Very low trust in our institution of government. It's very worrisome, right? And if we look at people over time, on this question of trust in the government to do what is right most of the time, right? You can see going back, this is obviously some sort of post-war high, back in those eras. So maybe something about here seemed, well, that's sort of pretty good. But then once we hit Nixon, right, things just started going south. Yeah, that happens, huh? And it really, this is 9/11. You see a little increase when 9/11 happens. But then, really, it doesn't really matter. Obama, Trump, Biden, no. Things aren't going well. People don't feel, this is why do people want change? Because they feel like it's not going well. So I want something else to happen, or at least there's enough people who want change to have the flip-flop that we're having in this constant change elections. We're divided and we're polarized. We have trifectas. That's when, there's unified control of the party in the states. Just like with the federal government, we have that going on in 40 places, right? 40 states have trifectas. Only 20 do not. And sort of what's interesting, right, is, these are the states, right? These are the purple states right now. Many of these, not all of them, but many of these are the purple states, the ones that don't have trifectas. Right? So we have a lot of stability under here. There's just a few places where things are going back and forth, and those places are making the decisions. So we're also divided by political party, and this is a really fascinating one because Democrats, of course, you may remember, controlled the Congress from during the war, World War II, until like 1994, the House of Representatives. And so anyway, you can see that going back to 1992, right, that the country has been way more democratic most of the time. There's been some occasional moments, 2010, right, when you had Republicans take both houses of Congress. Back in 2001, 9/11, but here we see for the first time in Gallup's poll that Republicans actually outnumber Democrats in terms of identification. That's a very new point, very interesting point, also very, very close. So we've had historic engagement, so all of this, polarization and social media, I think is a huge part in sort of helping people to vote. So we had historic engagement with the U.S. public for 2020. You see this is really high. If you wonder why Trump's always saying, what happened? How, he's saying that in part because there's just so many people voting, and we hadn't seen that kind of turnout literally since 1900, right? That's a long time. But people were at home, people had mail ballots, right? So maybe that makes a difference in terms of turnout. We also saw historic high turnout in 2018. Hadn't seen that kind of turnout since 1914. So historic engagement, people are interested. What's going to happen this year? I don't expect this to be this high. I expect it to come down. I'm expecting it to, come back to here, somewhere in here. We'll see if it can stay up there. A lot of questions about particularly young voters who don't seem as enthusiastic. Maybe the older voters seem to have really risen to the occasion with the change to Harris, but younger voters, there's a little more movement in that data, and they may not be as excited to settle for Harris, perhaps the way they settled for Biden in 2020, at least that enthusiasm that brought to them. So where are we today? So here's a electoral map of all the states. All the states in like gray are states that have changed, gone blue or red, right, since 2000. Right, and so these are considered the potential purple states where it might change, right? It's unlikely that Arkansas is going to change, or California, but these are the changes since 2000 that have gone away. And if we look at a few of these since 2000, it looks like they're unlikely to, be really up for grabs. So New Mexico and Colorado are pretty blue at this point. Can't see them changing. Indiana went for Obama in 2008, but haven't seen any sign of blueness there since, so I doubt that. Ohio went blue in 2008 and 2012, so did Florida, but we haven't seen that again. So I don't expect, Florida and Ohio, from our perspective, look like very red states at this point. It's hard to imagine them glowing blue, at least in this election. So we're really down to just a few states, right? And how did we get to those states? Those states have been turning red and blue. That's how come we know that they're more purple. There are also states that don't have trifectas, right? So all of these things sort of lead them to be the deciding states. So, is Harris the change candidate? Is she the status quo candidate? How did we get here? So I want to talk about the nomination because that was a nomination we've just never seen before. What happened? I'm still trying to recover from what happened in the nomination, and then something else happens and I can't even recover from it. So here we are for the Republicans. It just looked really normal. Here's Donald Trump. in terms of how many days he clinched the nomination. Looks very similar to John McCain or George W. Bush. So his nomination campaign looks really very similar. And actually Biden's looks very similar in that he had no contests. Nothing was contested. You may have not remembered these two people that ran against him. You may have forgotten them. I don't even remember them. I can't even tell you why you should know about them. But on April 25th, Biden announced his bid for re-election. The Democratic primary began January 23rd. It wasn't a contested contest, all right? He just easily won. These people basically got no votes. And he got the nomination in sort of a normal period of time in terms of vote counts, but there was never any question, right? Who was always going to be the winner. On May 15th, Biden and Trump agreed to debate on June 27th. Okay, that's weird. When do we debate in June when our election's in November and we don't start voting until October? Okay, that's weird, huh? Okay, then, on June 20th, right, the DNC votes to allow an early online nomination vote. Okay, that's also really odd. They supposedly did that because of ballot issues. There was this thing that the Ohio legislature passed, a law. They passed a bill and said you had to turn in your names for your candidates by this date, but they actually changed the law, right? So this was not a real issue. They did not have to do this. They could have had an open primary, right? They could have done the voting at the primary convention. They chose not to. They chose not to before the debate. I'm sorry, on June 20th, I called my colleague at Colorado State University, and I said, my goodness, this is a setup. If Biden doesn't do well, they're going to throw him out. I don't know what will happen then. Maybe he'll give it to Harris. Maybe it'll have an open convention. But this is a setup to, take, to make a change if they need it, right? And that is absolutely what happened. I rarely get those kind of calls, right? So I want to, pump it for all I can get. Okay. So in reality, though, this is a non-issue. That was a non-issue. They did not have to do that. So we all saw this, maybe some of us saw this, maybe some of us saw some stuff in replays, but it was ugly. And on Sunday, 3 weeks later, right after the campaign, after the debate, Biden said, no, I'm going to continue. On July 21st, he posted this letter to Twitter, of all places, so it is the center of our universe. Right? He did not go on TV. He just posted a letter and said, hey, I'm done. Kamala's great. She's been great. He did not endorse her here. A couple hours later, he sends out another message, I endorse Kamala Harris. Okay, that's pretty weird. Okay, certainly I've never seen that before. So this is really strange. And on August 6th, then they had their virtual vote, right? They had a virtual vote. It took place over 5 days. People could send in their ballots. And 99% went for Harris. 52 voted present, that they didn't vote at all, and then 80 people didn't vote at all. She was the only candidate on the ballot, of course. It was, you only needed 300 delegates to become a candidate, but no other candidates competed. And then after certification, she nominated Waltz for her vice presidential candidate, and then that was approved by the Democratic chair. Okay, so just from my perspective, as someone who's actually been to a Democratic National Convention and seen what's gone on there, this is the most undemocratic Democratic election I have ever seen. And I don't know, maybe that's just what happens, or we couldn't do anything else. But, the difference between being a party in Europe, where you have lots of parties and lots of representation, and the parties in America, where you only have 2 parties, and there are these big tents where people within those tents are competing for the power to control that party. This is something different. Now, maybe we're okay with it. I don't know. It seems like a lot of people are. But just as someone who's watched the party system for a long time, this is unusual. And, basically in 1968, we fought to get rid of this, right? And now we're okay with it? Okay, that's interesting. Maybe America's changing a lot. I don't know what it means, but it's definitely, as someone who is sort of a small D Democrat, I'm a little worried about it. Okay, so a status quo election fundamental, parties can win 2 terms, but it's hard to win 3 terms. So if Harris wins, is that a 2nd term? Or is that a 1st term? Or is that a 3rd or 4th term if we're counting Obama? I don't even know how to think about that at all. You know, it's sort of like, okay, I'm not sure we're changing the people, the party, but, you know, maybe this is something that sort of edges it towards her. Okay, this is one note that I'm going to give her. But both candidates are really unpopular. Here's her favorable ratings, and we can see they spiked up. You know, because a lot of people didn't really like her very much, and then she became the nominee, and sort of boom. Amazing how that can happen, and so she's kind of pulled back from that, but they're very close, right? Here's Trump unfavorables. He's actually gotten a little more likable, and she's gotten also a little more likable. So they've both gotten a little more likable and a little less.
Can I ask you a question on these polls, where it says Americans? How do you know that is a valid spectrum of Americans and not just some subset who answers the phone or does anything? Because I suspect everybody in this room never answers such a call. So are we not American?
You are. We couldn't do a full poll. We couldn't do a poll of everybody. You know, we
No,
can
of
do a
course you can't,
census.
but how do they normalize
Gallup
to
did
say
it.
that this is a valid representation?
Yeah. Well, we have sort of census data that we can look at, but we also have polling techniques that we use. I mean, Gallup is, I chose Gallup data because they've been around a long time. They have a lot of, you know, a lot of professionalism in their polls. They've been around a long time, so they're very consistent. Polling, I will say to you, is much harder today than it was 20 years ago. We weight the heck out of our polls to try to get them to look like the electorate. So this is, you know, one important difference between this is, let's say that these are Americans' opinions. These aren't necessarily voters' opinions. Some subset of this group is likely voters. And that's what's so difficult to get. To get, you know, a poll of Americans is actually much easier in terms of representative. We can look at the census and get a lot of information about what that data should look like. But in terms of likely voters, that's much harder, right? You know, if African Americans decide not to go to the polls, that's going to really hurt the Democratic Party. We saw that here in Florida in 2022, right? That's exactly what happened. You know, how did you know, Governor DeSantis, how did he go from 50, you know, basically 50% to 59% in an election cycle? It was because a lot of people dropped out. Chris was not a very mobilizing candidate to Democrats. African Americans didn't turn out at levels they turned out before. Democrats didn't turn out at levels they did before. Young people, right? So that's the really hard thing when it comes to the election polls, right? We're pretty good at this. The election polls are a little harder, especially in those close races, because who are those likely voters? Who's really going to turn out in that election? So who is the change candidate? So, you know, sort of classically, it's very clear that, you know, Republican Party, in this case, is the change party, right? Because the incumbent party is the Democratic Party, so incumbency goes to the Democrats. So the change candidate is Republicans and Donald Trump. You know, we want to change in policy. We've had 4 years of the current direction, so change is with the Republicans. Again, this is the ideology. We're sort of, you know, I don't know, administrative state, progressive, technocratic. This is populist, very anti-elitist. Clearly populist, anti-elitist. That's going to be change. That's more about change. Kamala's been in Washington for 8 years in a row. And I'm going to show another chart on this a little bit later. 4 years ago for Trump. So, you know, again, she's been around Washington longer. That makes her the status quo. On the other hand, she's brand new, right? She's, you know, sort of has the front runner status most days, and in most poll aggregators and in most prediction polls, with the exception of maybe Nate Silver. She's the first woman of color, so that's change. She's the youngest boomer candidate. He's the oldest boomer candidate. So she's happy and hopeful. That seems like much more about change. He's sort of angry and tough. So, you know, whatever you want to take away.
Excuse me, can I just ask a quick question about that? What can you define anti-elitist?
Anti-elitist, I would say, would be the anti-elitist would be people like us. We're part of the elites, absolutely. So professors are part of the elitist group. legislators, you have government officials, people in the deep state would be considered elites, right? People who have access to power.
So not people like Trump, but people who support Trump.
Yeah, well, I don't know many academics supporting Trump myself, but maybe. I mean, there certainly are some, I don't know.
Yeah, I won't say more.
Yeah. Okay, signs for change. People are really unhappy. The country, everyone's really unhappy. We can't, this is the highest unhappiness we've had. And, wrong track. Are we on the wrong track? 73%. Right. We have to go back to Bush to get this kind of we're on the wrong track. And, I don't know if you remember. This is after Katrina, right? He does pretty well. He gets really high. And then after Katrina, right, things just skyrocket out of control, and then the economy collapses right before the election. Just so you remember what happened. And then, right. So here we are, and we've been here since pretty much the start of Biden's administration. We're on the wrong track. Right? This is a sign for change. Why are we changing so much? Right? A sign sort of historically, if the incumbent party or the incumbent presidential approval is below 45%, it usually leads to the loss of the incumbent party. So that would be a signal for change. And change elections, again, are just the normalcy, right? Change election, change election, change election, change election, change. This is what's going on in American government, right? There's no why. We're very unhappy. We're on the wrong track. Of course, we're on the wrong track. How do we get on the right track? Well, we need change. Donald Trump's actually been in Washington less than Kamala Harris. As I said, she was in there 8 years, 4 years in the Senate, 4 years as the vice president. So if we look back in time here, I'm going back to 1920, back from 1920 to 1964, candidates with more years in Washington won 11 out of 12 times. But now, candidates with more years in Washington lose more often. Right? So we've really switched, put an interesting switch. We used to think that was a good thing. Now we want outsiders, right? We want who's the more outsider candidate. So that favors Trump. The economy remains the number one issue for voters. All voters, it's 81%, 93% for Trump supporters, 68% for Harris supporters. But, I don't see interesting. This was taken, when was this taken? September 2nd, so just a month ago, not even a month ago, and I don't even know if these issues would still be the same issues. This is a Pew poll. Pew also has a long history of doing polls and lots of experience. Just because I haven't heard anyone talk about healthcare, but immigration seems to have moved up a lot. I don't know, I just hear a lot, she's gone to the border, Kamala's gone to the border. It seems like that's risen in importance. So the economy is the number one issue, and if we look at who leads on the economy, it's Trump. Percent of registered voters who say they are very or somewhat confident that Harris or Trump can do each of the following: make good decisions about economic policy, 55%. Right? This is just the blue candidate, not the blue survey respondents. So Trump wins there. Make wise decisions about immigration policy, 52%. She does better on more ephemeral, again, that vibe thing, bring the country closer together. Oh, and make good decisions about abortion policy. I was really surprised that this gap wasn't bigger. I was surprised that gap wasn't bigger, and it made me wonder if the issue of moving that to the state level has really calmed that as an issue for this election. Right? I don't know, but in those states, we're not seeing the same thing that we saw in 2022. So it's starting, certainly the commercials are starting. So Trump gets credits for his beliefs, interestingly enough here, stands up for what he believes in, 69% to 60. But she wins on honesty, being mentally sound, and a good role model. Again, that vibe. The question is, how long can a vibe last? Right? I mean, that's really, eventually you've got to come out with some, what are you going to do? What does that look like? You can't just keep that going. Consumer confidence interval is 69. We're in the sea of red for the incumbent party down here. But then again, we have Gore up here. right? And what was that? That was another weird change election, right, where the Electoral College went one way. So I don't know, mixed signals, but clearly we're in the red category for a Democratic win. The misery index, here you're below this line. It's more likely to go to the out party. And here we are, 50-year average. So we're just right below that line, yeah.
I have to ask, what is the misery index?
Oh, it's a combination of different economic indicators.
Unemployment plus inflation.
Yeah. Yeah, that hasn't been good, unemployment plus inflation, right? That hasn't been good. But still, we're still, right at this line, just below. Right, so you can see why everything is so tight and crazy. Okay, so are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Well, you were paying, paying more for your gas than you did 4 years ago. Gas is always price of gas seems to have a really strong connection to presidential approval, interestingly enough. And, oh, wait, how did I get, I don't want to do that. I'm on the wrong one, there we go, almost over. Okay, I meant to, this slide, and then I'll go back to that one. So are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? This is adjusted median household income. So here we were right at the end of the Trump presidency. So he did have, during his presidency, the highest median household income, and that's lower than here, although it's not right when he left office. Right, here's the pandemic, right? Pandemic, right? And so then there's some bounce back from that. So I don't know. Again, how do people look at all that misery in Dallas? It's very close, and compared with other elections in the past. No, let me go back one more because I wanted to say this. This was a very interesting poll to me. This is New York Times in a poll. This was pre-debate. This was like just 2 or 3 days before the debate. Who is the change candidate? Do you think Kamala Harris, Donald Trump represents change or more of the same? Major change, 51%. Trump, more of the same, 56% Harris. Right? So sort of suggests that she might be change the status quo candidate. And then compared with other elections in the past 20 years, polls have been less accurate when Trump is on the ballot. It's pretty significant. So if we look at this over time, we can see that, about 4% was really huge in 2020. I mean, I think this has to do with the realignment that's going on underneath the electorate, at least somewhat, that the people who were in their homes answering the surveys and were thrilled to do so, right? They had a lot more time on their hands. Whereas, working class people were out working. There's also the fact that I think that the trust in institutions has led to, Republicans in particular, Trump supporters perhaps especially among that group, being less willing to respond to academic elite and media elite polls. And I have heard rumors in the polling industry that they're having a very hard time in their their phone polls or their in-person polls of getting Republicans to respond. So I think that that's significant. So whoever wins, unfortunately, is going to have more of the same. This is sort of what we look like right now in the Senate. This is sort of anticipated. This is the anticipated, and depending on who wins the election in Ohio, right, there could be an open seat there, or so we have sort of one uncertainty. This is just a projection, but this year's Senate cycle is particularly good for Republicans. Obviously, West Virginia is going to go Republican. We have Democrat there. Montana is a pretty red state. That's probably going to go Republican, but it's going to be close. Obviously, we're just incredibly close. It's like 50-50 everywhere, right? So keep hitting the wrong button. Here's where we are in the House, right? So if all of sort of the toss-up all of the toss-up congressional districts were to be won by Republicans, then they get 29 of them. Otherwise, if all of the toss-ups were won by Democrats, you know, we have 15 down here, so it's going to be very close in the Congress, either way. And, you know, boy, doesn't today look very different than the past. So more of the same. But I like to, when I think about American politics and I think about America, of course, it's flawed and imperfect, but it's robust and dynamic. You know, we can still capitalize and commercialize and capitalize companies like no one else in the world. That gives us a distinct advantage in economics. So we're robust and dynamic. We change back and forth. In fact, that's typical, right? The whole point of a two-party system is moderation, even though we've seen polarization lately, right? So, and maybe it's good for us, right? Because of corruption that goes on in the executive branch. And the status quo, the truth is that people are not as polarized as we think. And of course, we got to figure out how to get that out, but it's not, so, you know, that's hard, but it's not as bad as we think. And perhaps most importantly, American democracy is enduring. And we'll see what happens. That's it.
And we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, Jason.
So you started your talk with, you know, that the problem that you had before you started predicting elections in 2016 was that you were focused too much on the polling and you wanted to be more focused on the fundamentals. But a big message I got from this talk is it's very difficult to interpret almost every one of the fundamentals that you sort of brought forward here. It's like, who's the change candidate? How do we interpret the economic indicators? So it was all very interesting. What do we think? Is it just sort of like you know, it's going to be close? Like, is that sort of the conclusion that we draw from this? Or?
No, I mean, I think that I think that macro indicators say that it's a Trump winner. But I don't, you know, I'm on TV or whatever right now, so I'm scared. That's scary. That's a scary. But that's, I mean, I think it's a change election. And so I'm trying to step back. This is a change election. If we're in a change election, who's the change candidate? That's the out party. I think most of the macro indicators suggest that, but the candidate is Donald Trump, and he is not well liked, and you know there are memories, and you know it's a very complicated. You know, it's very complicated. I can't think of another time where we've, you know, incumbents come back to retest their waters. Right? Elections are about the future. I think, remember Gore, people were going to clear the field for Al Gore in 2004, and he said, no, elections are about the future. My election's about the past. I want to focus on the future. Yeah, Carol.
So you said that basically you gave us national stuff, but you also said that there are basically 7 states that are going to decide the election. So why do we even care about the national stuff when we really care about those 7 states?
Well, you know, I mean, it counts for everybody. You know, because I mean, we mostly focused on those in terms of our polling. If we were to look at our polling, and they're just very close in terms of the polling. So what do they provide us? I think those bigger picture things say that those places are the places where people are going to be willing to move. And I think it's those macro indicators that are important to them. I thought one big signal to me was the Teamsters deciding not to endorse, and I don't know if you looked at their polling, right, but you know, basically they supported a Biden-Harris ticket when it was a Biden-Harris ticket, but when it changed to Harris-Walz, they switched their support to Trump, and that's very, very interesting change. So I don't know what to make of that. Yeah.
My question, this is what the opinions are, but what does the research tell us about why they have these opinions? We've got a few more days till the election. Some places already started. You know, do we and the parties put their money in TV, you know, social media? Where does the message go? And what's the message? Is it fear or hope? You know, what's the message?
Yeah.
Have some research on that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, obviously change is about hope in the future. People are optimistic about the future. You can ask people, are we on the wrong track? And you say, can we get on the right track? You know, huge amount of them say, huge majority say, yeah, we can get on the right track. We're just on the right track. So people are optimistic about the future. Where are we? I mean, what are the implications of what these people think? What are the campaigns going to do? I think it's very complicated for the campaigns. It's very complicated to reach voters. I mean, 10 years ago, I stayed on TV to watch the ads when they came on. Oh, an ad, I get to watch it. I don't even see ads anymore, right? I mean, how am I pushed anymore? I get texts from people. It seems that texts are very popular. There are still ads. I understand, like when I was in Pennsylvania a couple of weeks ago, I only saw ads in the bars. I saw many, many ads. So they are very focused on those 7 states, and that's where all their attention is. I mean, that's, I think it's a complicated environment with social media. I do not know what the best ways to reach those uncertain voters at this point.
I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on this unusual thing that happened in the Democratic Party with Biden stepping back and Harris being sort of seemingly randomly chosen relative to what is typically occurs. And I guess my question is, since this is so out of the ordinary, it's unprecedented, kind of the strategy that they took. What do you think how does that come into play? And do you think it was strategic, given what you're seeing, or do you think it was a poor decision in terms of kind of pulling things together last minute?
It was a It was a controlled decision. How do we maintain control? Because when have we had an open convention, right? That's just open conventions go on forever. There could be many votes as opposed to a single vote. You see the party in fights. If we think back to that 1968 election and what happened in Chicago in the Democratic Party, you have riots going on out in the streets. Inside there are lengthy speeches going on late into the night. It was just a mess, right? And it was all on TV. You can't have that kind of mess on TV and feel like your party's in control. Like, just look out of control. That's not going to look good for your party. So I think it was a decision of control, right? Like, we have to control this is going to be on TV. We can't have the 9 different groups within our party fighting this out in a public space. So I think it was a controlled decision. There may have been issues around the money and the fact that it was Biden-Harris. I don't know. Those probably could have been litigated. I don't know. That's a complicated issue. But it's definitely the controlled decision. We want to keep control. Yeah.
I'm the parent of an 18-year-old who actually wants to vote. But she came to me the other day and said, I don't know if I trust the newspapers. I think they are polarized. So how do I help her educate herself, given her fundamental distrust of Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News?
Yeah, well, they're all very, very partisan. They're all very partisan now. It's hard to find a newspaper that's not a partisan information. That's really hard. I mean, I find that, I feel that way too. Like, who do I trust? I guess I spend a lot of time listening to what people say and, listening to podcasts now and stuff like that to figure it out. But I think it's very hard. I wish I had good advice. I don't know where you get the best information.
I told her, yes, read all of them.
Yeah, that's what I think is the best thing. That's what I do. And it moderates me to read all of the different news. It definitely moderates me to have more opinion from both sides. Yeah.
Yeah, is there any social force against polarization and division these days? I mean, in the past there were these disasters that united the country. I'm not sure what, something a little bit better these days.
Maybe aliens will land. That's one thought I have. Yeah, how do you end polarization? That's a really important question, and we have people thinking about that from all different kinds of angles. I think that, theoretically, the models tend to show that the way polarization ends is one side wins. You have an event You have, something happens, right? You have a civil war, you have a depression, something tilts it so that one side is clearly the winner, because the problem when you have such close and polarized world is that you can't create legislation that is lasting. You can't really govern, right? There is no place to govern from, and the other side hates what you're doing, so half the country is hating whatever you're doing when you're ruling. So it's very complicated. So some huge crisis that takes us off our internal look at ourselves, or something that makes one side clearly the winner. It's the other side down. I know. Also,
On that note of
Yeah.
hoping for a huge crisis and polarization, please join me in thanking Lonna for this And on behalf of the Faculty Steering Committee, I'm delighted to present you with this stunning Carothers Lecture mug. And the mug is a gift card to Calvin's Coffee Shop, which is a connection to the historical connection of this series back to the Westminster House. So thank you, Lonna. Appreciate it. Thank you all. Hope to see you at our next